Well, my name is Dorothy Stanforth Moss. I've lived my whole life, 88 years, in Canton, and I have only lived in 4 houses. I moved once before I was married, then I moved into a house after I was married, and then we moved into this house. My mother was born in Canton, and as it turns out, she only lived in 4 houses in her 92 years. Well, she lived here for her last 4 years, but um, she was born in Canton. My father was born in southern Ohio, and unfortunately, I know not a lot about his family other than that there were 9 children in his family. And his father was a stonemason. And I guess I saw him once when I was about 2 years old, but I don't remember him at all because he died very shortly after that. My grandmother, I did get to know because she spent some time with us several winters. She would come up and stay with us. So I did get to know her. And my grandparents on my mother's side were both born in Norway. So I like my Norwegian background. My grandfather was a toolmaker and he worked for the Elgin Watch Company first and then came to Canton because at that time there was a watch factory here, the Duber-Hamden Watch Company. And he worked for them. And there again, I don't know how they actually met. She came over here, and in 2 years they were married, and they had 3 children. My father came from a family of 9, and my mother came from a family of 3, and she was the middle child. But she had an older sister and a younger brother. And I knew them, but I really don't remember a lot about them because I was 5 and 6 when they died. So I remember my grandmother a little more because she lived another year after he died. But I often think about them and I wish I knew. I do have some more history because a cousin of my mother's came here and brought a book that has the history of my grandmother's family written in Norwegian. So, but he translated part of it. And so I do know that she came more from her family. And in fact, I'm actually in the book because it goes that far as the family history. In Norwegian, her name is Lina, Lina. They lived on a farm, and it was called Sand. And so they took the name of that farm. So her name was Lina Sand when she came over here. My grandfather's name was Nils Christian Aulie, Aulie. And again, his name was Nils, Nils, but they pronounce it Nels, so they changed it to an E. And my grandmother's name was Lena, but it was spelled with an I. And my aunt, they named Ida, and they spelled it Ida. So when she went to school, they called her Ida. And she said, my name isn't Ida, my name is Ida. So they changed it to spell the name Ida. My mother's name was Nora, and my uncle's name, her brother's name, was Torleif. I was born on March 10th, 1933. So I'm 88, going on 89 years old. I lived in a very stable family. I had one brother who was 5 years older than I was. So there were just four of us in my family. And my father had a business. Had a printing business. And my mother was a stay-at-home mom, which all mothers were almost back then. But she did work because she kept the books for the business. She was a bookkeeper. My mother, she was quiet, very patient. She was handy with her hands. I mean, she sewed. She made clothes for me. She crocheted. She went to a business school, so she had some further education. I actually have her high school graduation picture right there. My dad, he liked to fish. He didn't do a lot of fishing other than later years. We would go up to Lakeside, a place up on Lake Erie, and he would fish up there. He didn't ever catch very much, but he would fish. But then photography became a kind of his hobby. He built a dark room in the basement, so he would develop his own pictures. And he was in a photographer's club. I forget what it was called, but there were just the four of us. We didn't do any traveling much. We did go down to visit his family twice that I remember of, and then an uncle, just twice, I think. And I say my brother was 5 years older, and I really don't remember doing things with him. There was enough difference in our age, and he was always older than doing things older than his age. He was smart, very smart. He was very active in Boy Scouts. He wasn't athletic, though. I mean, he was never in sports, but he was musical. He played a tuba in the high school band, and that piano over there, my parents bought because he wanted to learn to play the piano. So they bought that for him when he was about 8 years old. And that's what he learned to play the piano. And then I took lessons on that too. But they didn't think they had room in the house for the piano at that time, the house they lived in. And somebody said, if he wants to play, you better get him one, because if he doesn't, then maybe he will lose interest. So they bought the piano. And then he later learned to play the pipe organ, and actually was the organist at the church for a while. And so he had a musical talent. I learned to play, but not as well as I wish I would have learned. But and my husband also plays piano, and the theater organ over there was his. So it was kind of a musical family. Neither my father nor my mother were musical, though. They liked music, but they had not had that opportunity, probably growing up, to learn an instrument or piano. But they enjoyed it, and they appreciated the fact that, and saw that we had the lessons that we needed. In 1948, my parents, my parents wanted to go up to the lake for a weekend. We had gone up there a couple times. I do remember being up at Lake Erie with my brother. That's the only vacation I really remember of being on with him. But they had been to another place on Lake Erie called Linwood, and they had heard about Lakeside. So we got to kind of the division when we go one way or the other, and he said, well, we've never been to Lakeside. Let's go see what it's like. So we spent the weekend at Lakeside. That has been our vacation time for our family ever since. We didn't go every year, but that summer we went for the weekend, and they said, maybe we could come back for a week in the summer, later in the summer. So they found a cottage, and we went back and rented a cottage for a week. Then they said, well, maybe next year we can go for 2 weeks. So we did that for a number of years. And then as my brother got married, as he had family, and as I had children, that was a great place to take children. Lakeside is a unique place. You can't explain Lakeside, you have to experience it. And that's what we did, and it just got in our blood, literally. This summer, just out of curiosity, I counted up over 100 people that have gone to Lakeside because of that decision my parents made. Maybe some of them would have gone otherwise, but I know that they came directly because of that decision made by, invited by other people that were there because of that decision. You see the ripple effect? My father went to college, but he never graduated. He went to a Bible college in Tennessee, and he went to Hiram, and he went to Bethany. But by transferring, and I know he had to work his way through school, and that's, I think, where he got printer's ink on his hands. And they say once you get printer's ink on your hands, you never get it off. And that's 2 years before they got married, he bought a business and then ran that business the rest of his life and passed it on to my husband, and we passed it on to our son. My father was known as a church printer because that was before the days of word processors and copy machines. So he did a lot of work for a lot of churches, newsletters and bulletins and envelopes, letterheads, things like that. So like I said, he was known as a church printer. He had other customers too, but when my husband got carried on the business and he was sick with cancer, he put his name on every church's prayer list that he could because he figured if one didn't work, another one would. But, and that was kind of interesting. My husband and I went to high school together. He was a very popular young man. And it was funny because when I told my aunt that I was going to a dance with him or something, she said, he's a really nice boy. He's our paper boy. You know, they delivered papers at that time. He actually lived, you could see his house from my aunt's house. And so I didn't have to worry about making sure my family liked him. He was just a very personable person. He also sang. He was very musical. He had a beautiful voice and used that. He was the choir director at our church for 25 years. He sang at a lot of weddings, people he knew and people he didn't know. So that was kind of his avocation. And we had a off and on relationship for till we were both in college. He went to Ohio State. I went to the College of Worcester first for 2 years, and I decided I wanted to be a school teacher, and they didn't have elementary school program. So I transferred to Wittenberg, and we got back together when I was at Wittenberg and he was at Ohio State. And we got engaged the summer after we graduated. And at that time, there was a draft for young men to go into the service that had been carried over. There was no war at that time, but there was still a draft. 1954. And he knew that he would be drafted because he had been exempted while he was in school, in college. So he volunteered for the draft so he could get that over with because he knew that wouldn't be able to get a really good job. So he went in the Army that January, and after basic training, and he was in what was called the Counterintelligence Corps at that time. They actually had to come and check me out because we had gotten married, but no, I'm sorry, we had not gotten married, but we were engaged at that time. And he, after his training, his assignment was the Pentagon, and he was there as a civilian. I mean, people weren't supposed to know he was in the Army, he was in the service. So he lived with a couple other friends that were in the same situation, rented a house from an older man. And so we decided he was living as a civilian, so that after 6 months we got married. He had another actually after he was there 3 months we got married. We were married June 16th, 1956. So I went down and lived down there with him and worked in the Brentano's bookstore in the Pentagon. So he went there in the Army, which nobody knew. It was secret. He was a gopher. I mean, he worked for a colonel or somebody, but it was very menial work. But there was a weekend when he had to be called into the work because there was some scare of some kind. Actually, the area that he worked for was what was in charge of the safety of the Pentagon. But there was only one time when he had to go in. So then, when he was discharged that January, and I had actually stayed home and taught 2 years because I didn't want to get married until he was out of the service. So when he was stationed in the Pentagon, that kind of changed our plans. But I had taught school for 2 years here in Canton. I taught children with physical disabilities. So it was an interesting class. I had 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. I had worked one summer while I was going to school. I had worked at a home for crippled children. And I just thought that was very satisfying. So then when we came back after he was discharged from the Army, he didn't have a job, of course. And my father wanted to be sure I was taken care of, I guess, so he offered him a job. My brother became a doctor, so there was nobody to pass the business down to. So I don't know whether my dad had this kind of in the back of his mind that there would be somebody to continue the business, but my husband was willing to learn, So he did. And I thought I would go back to teaching even after David was born. Well, I by the time I felt I was free enough to go back, I would have had to go back to school to get my teaching certificate renewed. So we kind of figured it maybe wasn't worth it. At that time, I even to do that, I wouldn't have been able to do what I was doing at home, which I did a lot of sewing. I sewed almost all my own clothes and Sarah's. Um, I wouldn't have been able to cook the way I did if I was working. So I just didn't think it was practical to do it. And as it turned out, um, I was then a stay at home mom all those years. David Todd, and he was born in April of 1957 on uh, uh, April 26th. April 27th, 1958, his brother was born, Daniel Eric. And then 13 months later, another brother was born, Jeffrey Allen. And then we waited almost 4 years till another brother was born, J. Andrew. Here I had four boys, and I never liked boy things, but I had to learn to like boy things pretty quickly. And then 3 years later, a girl was born, Sarah Jane. So, four boys and one girl. There were times when it was pretty chaotic around here. They were really good children, though. Fortunately, they were very healthy. None of them had any major health problems. We went through the measles, mumps, all those things, but they were healthy. Uh, they went through school with no problems. And then I have grandchildren that have gone on to college. I have a very well educated family. 1988, and that was 2 years after my mother had died, and the printing business was changing. I had seen the printing business go from very primitive, even though my father had uh, presses and a linotype to set the type. But from the time you put it letter by letter to what it is today, but the linotype uh, offset printing was becoming popular, which is where you made a plate, but you had to have it set on a computer. So, guess who offered to learn the computer and learn to make the plates? I had never touched a computer. So that summer, 1988, we bought an Apple computer, and I went down there on the second week of July. They brought it in and set it all up for me. He said he would be back in a week to see how I was doing. So I had to teach myself how to do that, and we put a newsletter together that week. And I'm still doing it. When COVID came almost 2 years ago, after I was out in California for somebody's wedding, when I came back, everything was closed down and I couldn't go back to work. So they brought the computer here, and I have it in the den, and I have done work on that computer here at home. So 50, no, 30, from 88, yeah, 50, almost 50 years. I have been working. So I did go back to work.
So you were born in 1934.
33.
33. You were born in 1933, and in the 88 years, your
Right.
lifespan, you've seen a lot of changes. What would you say from 33 to 2021? What are the monumental points in your lifespan that you said, I would never see this happen, but you saw it happen?
When my husband and my son took over that business, to put a little booklet together, you would have to set the type or to do it on the computer. You would have to put it on the press, run one page, and then another, the backup, then another page in the backup. Then when you had all the pages done, you'd have to collate, you'd have to fold them on a folder, which we had, and then you'd have to collate them, put them together, and then you, if there were enough pages, you'd probably have to staple it and put it on a stitcher and staple them. And then sometimes you'd wanted to trim it to make sure they was nice and trimmed. This just a month ago, my husband, my son, who is now still working in the printing business for the company that bought our business, did that one of those same books on a digital printer all at the same time. It printed color, which would have been impossible with the work that, unless you had a 4-color press, which we didn't have. But he put the paper in, he put the paper for the cover in. I set the type or set the book up on the computer. I emailed it to him. He put it in his computer. It made a booklet out of it, so the pages were in the right order. It printed front, back, all the pages, collated them, folded them, stapled them, and came out done. The only thing he had to do was trim the edges so they'd be even, all in one step. And that's how the printing business has evolved in my lifetime. And I always think there's hardly a day goes by that you don't handle something printed. And most people haven't a clue how it gets there, even now.
Most people don't.
Because before the computers, when type was set on linotype, if you wanted to change one word, sometimes you had to set a whole column because of the spacing. And I can change one letter and it doesn't make any difference on the computer. I mean, it does it by itself. It always amazed me when I found out that it would even continue to the next page or the next column. Oh, it does. The computer knows that. It's still kind of dumb sometimes, though. The other area would be in the medical field. There again, because I had a brother who was a doctor who died at 62 from an aortic aneurysm. But, and because of my association with handicapped children, there was always kind of a medical interest. And my daughter now coding medical records. One summer between college years, I took electrocardiograms at the hospital. My brother worked there, so I took EKGs. So there's always been a medical interest, and I think when I see what they can do with surgeries, and there again, computers can make artificial limbs, which I have never seen, but I would love to see done. So I think that in the computer world, I mean, that just, it has its good aspects and some that are not so good. But the fact that there again, you can, these little phones and all those, what they can do.
What sorts of things would you want to encourage your grandkids or their kids? What is there, like, advice, or is there like an encouragement that you would want to give? Like, would you want to implore them to do something or be a certain way?
Well, I just encourage them to think, to explore, to take advantage of the opportunities that there are, but don't lose sight of the common things, the things that we end up taking for granted, because they can be lost too. Friendships, love, loyalty, all those good things. And just ordinary things. Just we have a little interruption. Anyway, I think sometimes life can get too involved. And I guess because I've lived a pretty simple life. That's my phone.
Oh, that's your phone. Okay.
Yes, it'll only ring 4 times.
What does it mean?
Little
It'll go
symphony
off.
we have going on in here.
That's what you live with, interruptions. And life can be that way. That's a good example. You think you have your life planned out, and then there are interruptions.
Where do you find your inner peace spiritually?
At church. That's another thing. My family, my father actually went to Bible college, and my mother was Lutheran, and he belonged to the Disciples of Christ Church. But I was raised, my brother and I were raised in the Lutheran Church. And I'm still Lutheran. And there was never a question as to whether we were going to go to church on Sunday. The only times we didn't go was if I was sick. But, I mean, that was just routine. That was just part of life, was to go to church. And I kind of carried that through. Sometimes if a child said they didn't want to go to church, well, then you're going to stay in the house all the rest of the day. Of course, now that wouldn't be any punishment because they do that anyway. But they wanted to go outside and play or do their own thing. So they all went to church every Sunday. And that has carried over, not in exactly the same ways, but they all have church affiliations. So I can't say that was a mistake, certainly.
Do you have any hopes or things or stuff you want to do with the time that you have ahead of you?
Well, I'm very satisfied with what I've done. The little bit of traveling I've done, I've seen parts of the country I never thought I'd see. so I have no plans to any big trips or anything like that. I'm so fortunate that many of my family are close that I get to see them. If I wanted to, I could see them. I mean, they're close enough that I could see them every week, most of them. And the ones that are far away, they do come home once in a while, so I get to see them. And there again, even without seeing them, we Zoomed. We got to see them that way. So I guess that's the most important thing.